Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into something genuinely fascinating. We are objectively deconstructing a highly charged Model United Nations dossier to see exactly how a nation builds a complex, multi-layered geopolitical argument. We're looking at a hypothetical scenario between the delegates of India and Pakistan, and we're going to unpack the entire toolkit, the rhetorical strategies, the historical evidence, the heavy emotional appeals, all used to justify aggressive state action. Now, my goal here isn't to take a side, not at all. I'm just your guide through what is essentially a masterclass in political framing, so you can spot these exact same strategies the next time you're watching the news. All right, let's get right into it. We're kicking things off with this incredibly provocative thesis straight from the Indian delegate's opening speech. Pakistan is not a victim of terrorism, it is the incubator, the world's most famous export factory for terror. Boom. By starting right there, the delegate just completely grabs the room's attention and sets an intensely aggressive baseline. I mean, there's absolutely no diplomatic softening happening here. They're directly attacking the opposing nation's core narrative of being a victim, flipping it totally upside down to accuse them of being the primary architect. So, how exactly does the delegate build this intense case? Well, we're going to follow this roadmap. First, the anatomy of the accusation. Second, decades of proxy conflict. Third, the human cost. Fourth, appealing to international law. And finally, the new normal doctrine. All right, moving right into our first section, anatomy of the accusation, defining the core action. The delegate anchors their entire justification around one specific military event called Operation Sindoor. Now, the dossier defines this as an operation focused on dismantling 9 terror launch pads in Bahawalpur and Muradkay. Look at the framing here. It's really strategic. The opponent apparently tried to characterize this strike as just a populist stunt, but the presenting delegate works relentlessly to rebrand it. They argue, no, this isn't some political grab for votes. It's an act of necessary professional justice, striking right at the heart of state-sponsored cowardice.
Moving on to Section 2, decades of proxy conflict, the historical record.
To actually justify a massive military operation like that, the dossier has to establish a long-standing pattern of behavior. So they point to source materials like this NDTV report, outlining a strategy that extends all the way back to 1947, detailing how proxy terror groups have allegedly been utilized by the neighboring state. And the absolutely crucial point the delegate is making here revolves around this concept of plausible deniability. You see, by using non-state actors, meaning terror groups, to cross borders and carry out these attacks, the accused nation can officially shrug and claim ignorance while still inflicting real damage. The delegate uses this to argue that proxy conflict isn't just some random accident, it's a deeply ingrained state policy.
To really hammer this point home, the presentation visually builds this relentless timeline of escalating violence. We're looking at Operation Gibraltar in 1965, the Kargil War in 1999, the devastating Mumbai attacks in 2008, the Pulwama attack in 2019, all the way up to the focal point of this specific dossier, the Pahalgam attack in April 2025. By mapping these events out sequentially like this, the delegate is meticulously constructing a narrative of continuous, unprovoked aggression spanning decades.
And the sheer volume and severity of these attacks, that's leverage to make a much broader strategic point. Looking at this heavily documented history, the delegate asserts that their neighbor doesn't just experience terrorism, but actively harbors what they call an Ivy League of terrorism. This historical weight is explicitly designed to make any calls for diplomatic patience look hopelessly naive to the rest of the Model UN Council.
Now, we hit Section 3, the human cost and emotional anchoring.
This is where the whole argument pivots from clinical statistics into something incredibly raw. Up until this point, we've been talking about launch pads and historical timelines, but right here, the delegate introduces the specific human toll of the April 2025 Pahalgam attack, where 26 civilians were murdered in Basiran Meadow. This is a highly deliberate rhetorical shift. They're essentially putting a human face on all that abstract data we just looked at, grounding the entire geopolitical debate in stark, undeniable tragedy.
To absolutely maximize that emotional impact, the speech zooms all the way in on one highly specific, heartbreaking story, the Asaveri Jagdale narrative. The delegate details how her father, Santosh Jagdale, was forced to his knees by terror groups. He was executed simply for his religion while out on family holiday, right while his 26-year-old daughter Asaveri watched helplessly. And now, the delegate points out, she is lighting a memorial lamp in Pune. This isn't just storytelling, guys. It's a calculated emotional anchor. It takes the abstract high-level concept of state policy and makes it incredibly personal and horrific, which in turn justifies a severe military response. And this emotional segment culminates in an absolutely devastating rhetorical trap. Can you look into the camera right now and tell Asavari Jagdale that her father's life was a necessary sacrifice for your state policy? Just think about the sheer power of that in a debate setting. It forces the opposing delegate into an impossible corner. If they try to respond by talking about complex political narratives or diplomacy, they instantly look heartless in the face of Asavari's grief. The delegate is using that grief to validate Operation Sindoor as an act of strict moral necessity, not just some military strategy.
Okay, Section 4, appealing to international law and justifying the action.
So, right after establishing those intense emotional stakes, the presentation dramatically shifts gears again, moving to a clinical, legalistic interpretation of global rules. The delegate brings up Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, this is the article that secures the inherent right of self-defense if an armed attack occurs. They use this specific legal text to completely reframe Operation Sindoor. By citing Article 51, they're making the case that crossing a border to destroy terror launch pads isn't an act of illegal aggression, and it's not an invasion. Actually, it's a legally sanctioned, inherent right to protect your own citizens from an active threat.
Then, the argument weaponizes UN Security Council Resolution 1373 from 2001. This is a binding mandate that requires all states to deny safe haven to anyone who finances, plans, or commits terrorist acts. The delegate outright accuses the opposing nation of systematically and grossly violating this binding international law. They're essentially standing in front of the Model UN Council and saying, look, we are the ones following the rules here, and our opponent is breaking them.
And to prove this violation of Resolution 1373, the dossier points to the ultimate historical example. On one side, we have the documented fact of Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of 9/11, living comfortably in a custom-built compound in Abbottabad, literally mere yards away from a premier military academy. And on the other, just a bold red question mark. The delegate asks the council, does this reflect a simple lack of capability to find terrorists, or does it actually prove a deliberate state policy of providing safe haven? The implication they're making, of course, is that it's absolutely an intentional state policy.
Let's look closely at how the delegate actively contrasts the labels of populism and professionalism. The opponent views dismantling these terror hubs as a populist stunt, just a cheap trick for domestic votes. But the presenting delegate fiercely rejects that framing. They frame the action instead as the responsible, professional, and entirely legal duty of a sovereign state protecting its people. By reclaiming the narrative this way, they're attempting to completely strip the opponent of any moral high ground.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the New Normal Doctrine and Strategic Shifts.
This is the moment where the entire argument culminates in a massive, uncompromising shift in strategy. The delegate officially introduces what they call the Prahar Doctrine. The dossier defines this as a policy that formally ends the era of strategic restraint. You know, for decades, the norm might have been to absorb an attack and then seek diplomatic recourse. Well, the Prahar Doctrine intentionally decouples talks from consequences. It boldly declares that the era of patience, the era of issuing dossiers, is completely dead, and it's being replaced by a policy of immediate, proactive, and guaranteed military retaliation.
And they outline some extremely concrete, severe steps for this: suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, severing all bilateral trade, closing every border, and proactively exporting destruction right back to the terror sources. The delegate is operating under the stated premise that blood and water cannot flow together. This represents a complete, unyielding severance of normal diplomatic and economic ties. This really powerful rhetorical flourish perfectly encapsulates the core message of this entire geopolitical stance. You can burn our flags every Friday, but you can no longer burn our homes without a crushing receipt. Wow. It's an incredibly vivid, memorable way of stating that the threshold has fundamentally shifted. Any perceived attack will now be met with a guaranteed, disproportionate, and crushing response. I want to leave you all with this final thought. In the context of this Model UN scenario, we've just seen how a state can weave history, raw emotion, and international law to justify discarding patience in favor of outright aggression. So consider the profound global implications here. If the era of strategic restraint is truly over, and if such an uncompromising, retaliatory new normal doctrine becomes standard practice on the world stage, how exactly will this reshape the fragile balance of global geopolitics and nuclear deterrence? It's a terrifying yet completely fascinating question to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.